compete with each other. So if you are in Southeast Asia, it's not that China as a country or its macro level firms cut a deal with a firm in Cambodia. It can be from Sichuan province, they come and have a negotiation.
Hello, I'm Layne Hartsell with the Korea IT Times, and I'm here with Vijay Prashad of the Tricontinental. He's also written so much. I'm going to just give a couple things here. Indian historian and journalist, executive director, as I said, of Tricontinental. He's also the editor of Left Wing Books. Is this correct? The editor, okay.
Left Word Books, yeah.
Left Word Books, okay. And author of 40 other books, including Washington Bullets, which is a great title, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, great book. And also, he's the chief correspondent for Globetrotter, which I saw on the online. I didn't know that. You've also appeared in the film Shadow World 2016 and Two Meetings 2017. Vijay, welcome. Thank you for your time already.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I approached you with, there's so much going on that if I leave the news on my phone, I don't know if we could get through the interview, because I just saw just before I was going to talk to you that the end game now for the U.S. is bombing nuclear facilities in Iran. I mean, I'm kind of like, should we talk about that the whole time that we have together, or do we talk about what I had originally wanted to? I feel a bit selfish when they're bombing nuclear sites. But anyway, that's the news I saw. And if I sat here and watched it, I'm sure we wouldn't be able to get through the interview. So I'm going to turn off the news. A little of your background.
Let me just say about that, the fact is that those things are going to happen regardless of whether we are talking to each other or not, and in fact, so much of Mr. Trump's statements are bluster. And it's really, the guy has walked into a miscalculation. He's not used to this situation. Normally, banks bail him out when he does a bad real estate deal. Somebody bails him out. He comes from that class of people that are coddled, and I don't think he expected the Iranians not to bail him out. They just said, "Sorry, pal. You walked into the bear trap. We're going to eat you now." And I don't think but those things are going to happen regardless. So I think that we just continue with our conversation as long as we're not, neglecting the fact that those things are happening.
Yeah. So, thank you for addressing that, because bombing nuclear sites is probably the most important thing other than climate change going on right now. Okay, so Vijay, a little of your background first. You started out in journalism. You're a historian. You've written some great books. Activism. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I frankly am somebody who's very interested in storytelling. And, some years ago, the great Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano made a comment which I think is very interesting. He said that scientists are wrong. Humans are not made of atoms. Humans are made of stories. And I think that's correct, because everything is made of an atom, in a sense, like living things are made of atoms, and other things are made of other substances. And that doesn't actually define necessarily what they are. Is a lion defined by the nature of its skin, the color of its fur? Is it defined by the roar it makes, or is it defined by its behavior, or whatever, And I think Galeano has a point there, that what actually makes humans is our capacity for stories, for telling each other stories. That's how people fall in love with each other, is that they fall in love with each other's stories. That's how, communities exist. They exist on the back of stories of ancestors and their contemporary, reason for existence. And communities become nations where stories become so fundamentally important. and so on. I mean, you and I are telling each other stories. The first question you ask me is about a story. Tell me your story.
Mhm.
And so I'm fascinated with storytelling, and I think there are different levels of storytelling. Journalism is one level. It's the story of the moment. The most basic storytelling is gossip, which is the first draft of journalism. You're always interested in gossip. What did somebody say about this or that?
Right.
You know, but eventually, as you get more sophisticated stories, you move from journalism to history. History writing being perhaps the most sophisticated form of storytelling we have in our time. Maybe later there'll be something else, but now it's history writing. It takes the essence of myth and tries to find truth in myth, and tries to find truth in the kind of complex of stories that exist. So I got involved in journalism as a way to go out onto the street with a notebook, and a pen, and write down people's stories. And that's what I started doing. I've a history of that, and I moved into history writing because I realized that some stories are too complicated for deadline journalism. They require more, and they require depth and research and so on. So it starts there. It's a very simple desire. My desire initially wasn't to change the world. It was to listen to what the world was saying. And
Mhm.
eventually, when I started listening to the world, I realized that, this is not sustainable, and that something had to change. And, my political sensibility comes out, as it would, from storytelling.
Mhm. I'm glad that you mentioned Galeano because he weaves these stories like he tells the story of Potosi in Bolivia, the great silver city, which many people don't realize that was like the center of the world at one point. He talks about that, and he talks about Latin America, the open veins of Latin America, this kind of thing, and you do also in your work. You follow in that line. Um, when did you have you always worked on political storytelling or getting involved in that, or when did you get involved in that? Is it kind of an activism? Is it integral, or is it separate in your view?
When you grow up in a place like India, when you're in India or in Thailand or wherever you are, in poor countries, it's impossible not to be struck by levels of poverty or levels of dismay. I mean, these are normal things. Like, you'd have to be blind
Right.
not to be struck by that. I mean, what story in a country like India doesn't intersect with the need to change things? What story? Give me one story. Let's take cricket, which I also write about, sports.
Oh,
It's completely imbued with the need for change, because you want poor children to play, to have the opportunity to have sports fields, and to have equipment and things like that. You want to write about music or art. Yeah, we want community centers where kids can come in and they can play a musical instrument. And it's impossible in our world for these issues not to rise up. I mean, one says, oh well, that's a political thing. Is it really political? Because, I mean, I would like to reduce that desire that all children must have a musical experience. I would like to reduce that desire to morality, not to politics. I
right.
would like to make that a simple moral gesture for human beings, that in the realm of human morality of our period, the morals of humans, we say one of our statements is all children must have the opportunity to play a musical instrument. That's not a political statement,
Right.
because I would like to take it outside politics. I would like to imagine that there is no person in the world today that will say, no, some children should not have the opportunity to play a guitar. I can't imagine that there's actually going to be a political party organized that wants to prevent children from having musical experience, or that there's a political group that says no, children should not play sports. I just can't imagine that. So in fact, most of the things that I'm interested in, part of my struggle is to move them from the realm of politics into the realm of morals.
Sure.
That this is something that, if you want to live in a morally just universe, yeah, all children should have to go to sleep with a full stomach. All children should have some protein in the day. This should not be up for political debate. That's what I'm trying to
That's right.
suggest to you, that for me the journey was, I'm going to collect stories, but it's in a context of extreme deprivation. When you realize that there are children, young people just like yourself, who don't have the similar experiences, who are struggling to survive day by day. And you think, well, that just shouldn't be. That's not a political thing. That's just the way human life, should be oriented. Yeah. Now, politics comes in when we debate how to do it. How to do it. But I don't want to live in a world where there's actually groups of people that are in the party of no. And that's part of the problem, is that in the debate about how to do it, we've smuggled in the party of no. So people will say, well, we let the private sector do it.
Right.
But you well know that since there's no profit to be gained by music education for every single young person, there's no profit to be gained. The private sector is not going to enter there. So that's a malicious way of smuggling in the party of no into the debate about how to get something done.
And to do
And
that,
that's really where most of my work has been in the recent period.
It's interesting because just mentioning that to get every child on the planet to have exposure to a guitar class or music class would probably cost $500 million for every kid. It is not like it's expensive, right? It could be done online. It can be all, yeah. So this constant no that you talk about is like a market kind of thing. And I want to talk about that actually. Let me move over to China. I think that one of your, I would say one of your major projects, just from reading your work, is China and Asia. And this, and even you talk about this, the world moving back to the center. Many scholars are talking about this, the world moving back to the original centers of actual decent humanity, you could say. I mean, there were wars and there's a lot of bad stuff too. But I want to talk about the China model with you. And when I wrote to you about this, I didn't have the quote from Trump, and he gave us this remarkably in the time I was waiting to interview. So I'm going to read a quote from Trump about China, so I don't sound like a communist myself. And then they say, oh, he's a communist, this kind of thing. So President Trump, I mean, this was just like, I don't know, 3 days ago or something. It was during the current war. He talks about how the Chinese have done such a great job with manufacturing, and then he says, "quote I don't know how this is done because it shouldn't work in theory, and we, meaning him and the elites, oligarchs, we go to the best schools, Wharton School, and this kind of thing. We read all of the great books, and yet here's China." I want to ask you, Vijay, because you're an expert in this area. You just left China. You've received, I think maybe you're on faculty at universities there and so forth. What's going on here when I hear this coming from the center of enterprise system?
I mean, firstly, it's a question for you to ask Donald Trump. I don't know exactly what he's talking about, but let's assume we have permission to be, his ventriloquizing for him. Firstly, it is a fact. It is just a fact that manufacturing globally has shifted from the Atlantic world to Asia over the course of the past 50 years, from the 1970s onward. There's been a gradual shift accelerated in the last 25 years. So, about half the period, there was a real acceleration. It is a fact that the share of gross domestic product coming out of Asia, not just China, but China, India, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Bangladesh has increased astronomically. It's really quite remarkable. It's also a fact that it's not just low-end manufacturing. It's a fact that it's high-end science and technological goods. I mean, the world's best high-speed rail are produced in the public sector by China and India. India produces high-speed rail in the public sector, not in private enterprise. Very good quality high-speed rail. All of these changes have happened over the course of the past 50 years, and they've happened slowly in the first 2 decades. In other words, from the 70s till the era of so-called globalization, and then they accelerated in the era of globalization, particularly since the year 2000, really accelerated. With the financial crisis, and here's the third point, the United States and its European allies found that their growth rates basically collapsed. These are all, what I'm just saying, are all factual statements. They can be verified at the World Bank, at the International Monetary Fund, and so on. Their growth rates collapsed. Their investable capital basically became completely unpatriotic. And here comes my first moral judgment. That investable capital, that means that the profits coming out of the West, out of Western companies, private sector companies, companies often owned by individuals, which is an interesting thing you don't see in places like China. It's very rare to see a Jack Ma character, and when he goes out of line, he's disciplined. It's very rare to see that. In the West, increasingly, individuals or families controlling companies again. They are not as much joint stock companies as they used to be. Okay, so these companies now with their profits, they are not converting that profit into research and development or into industrial manufacturing. It's just not for them profitable. They've got a model of profit that allows them no longer to tie their profits up in manufacturing or in research and development. They are basically taking the profit out in liquid form, and they are buying assets of different kinds, including real estate, including vanity projects like we'll go to the moon or whatever they're doing. But they are not necessarily redeploying the money into research and development. Right. And so this has left, in a sense, let's call it Western sections, Western firms at a disadvantage, because they are now taking advantage of developments happening elsewhere. New breakthroughs taking place in Eastern countries and so on. So this has put Trump, shaken him up, I think, when the oil companies, after he went and kidnapped Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, when he brought the oil companies into the White House, they said, we're still not going to invest in Venezuela. Yeah, we don't care what you did. I think that shook him up. Right. He's used to banks underwriting him, forever, whatever he does. Here, the companies aren't willing to underwrite him. They are not willing to invest. They're not willing to do the drill, baby, drill. When you say drill, baby, drill, yeah, the slogan of the Republican National Convention, who's going to invest in the drilling machines? It's not going to be Chevron and so on. They don't need to invest in the drilling machines. They want somebody else to pick up the tab. Right. And so what happens is it's going to be maybe a Chinese company that comes in and says, okay, we'll invest, but then we need a stake in the project. We're not going to give you the money. And we're seeing that all over the world. So why is China, for instance, able to, well, for one, the country is dominated by the Communist Party of China, which does not allow profit to be the principal motivation. So now profit leads you to the view that I would rather think about my profit skimming then I'm going to think about my reinvestment, because capitalism is not driven by investment, it's driven by the desire for profit.
Money and money.
Whereas the Communist Party in China has put investment as a priority, not profit. And so they are rolling in large amounts of their surplus into science and technology and manufacturing investment. And so that's the simple reason for the success of the Asian development. And this is nothing new. This was there in the so-called Asian tigers, when the storyline was there for South Korea, for Taiwan, and so on. Japan. It was about investment capital. But then the other issue was that these were late industrializers, so that they were also doing steel like the US, but the US was stuck with fixed capital in less productive or slightly more inefficient steel manufacturing, such as at US Steel in Gary, Indiana. Whereas in the Asian developments and in Germany after the war, because their steel factories had been bombed, they built leaner, smaller, high-tech steel manufacturing. Today, the issue isn't that. The issue isn't that China is a late industrializer, that it's doing things better because it came in later. No, it's not that. It's that they are doing things better because they're actually investing in research and development. And research and development is actually where industry is happening today. Industry today is not happening in factories as much as in R&D, because factories are much easier to retool. They are much leaner and sleeker. You don't have to build a US Steel type factory anymore. That's not where chips are made, for instance. Chips are made in a much leaner fashion. So the real industrial developments are taking place in research and development and in the new productive forces. And here, whereas Xi Jinping of China is talking about the need to invest in new productive forces, Trump is not able to articulate an agenda because, he can't mobilize the investable capital. It's not his fault. It's that the capitalist system can't keep up with a system where the Communist Party basically describes what should be the goals of a country.
Let me add in here also, there's Japan and MITI back in our last century, same kind of thing. Chalmers Johnson said that Japan's the only communist country that made it. I mean, the productive system with the kind of technology oversight, I guess you would say, with some kind of mixed market is tremendous. And Trump says it right here, obviously. We don't need to tell people that.
Yeah.
And so Japan would be along the same idea, right? Except they got into the...
Well, so at the time of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Japan, yes, they had central planning. But by the way, at that period, so did the United States.
So did the United States.
Japan's rise at the time was in fact more closely linked to Alice Amsden's late industrializing model, because they had to rebuild industry from scratch and therefore were able to use the latest manufacturing technologies, which you can't pivot from US Steel, in a sense so easily, in the 1950s. And so you had all this fixed capital that could not be abandoned because it was still producing steel. So Japanese steel was a higher quality as well because it was new manufacturing technology. But that's not what China's advantage is. China's advantage today is not late industrializing. It's principally the fact that it's managed, it's managing its industrial development and it's managing the development of new productive force, and it's plowing enormous amounts of its surplus into science and technology. I mean, it's unimaginable. We don't grasp it. And one reason we don't grasp it is there are no really good numbers available, because You see, China is interestingly organized. People think it's a centralized state. They don't know anything about China.
Right.
China has provinces. Provinces are really quite powerful entities.
Mhm.
Provinces have their own finances. They are the ones also who are funneling in money, competing with each other. In China, it's not capitalist firms competing with each other that produces dynamism. It's the provincial competition. It would be like if in the United States, California was in competition with New York, or something like that. Today, it's unimaginable to think of US states. In fact, if that was the case, it would be very interesting, Layne, because then there would be an incentive for smaller states to merge together. Because one of the things that's so unproductive about the United States is the state structure. Like,
Right.
for instance, if you had the seven mountain states or whatever, six joined together, the Idahos, the this, the that, all of them come together and they have a larger geographical spread. They can plan for the whole geography.
Mhm.
They can bring together the net resources, bring together the net capital, plan all together, get one grid together, and so on. In the case of the United States, you have all these tiny states, Rhode Island, what is, the whole of New England should be one economic development state. There should be one governor, and they should be competing with New York State, for economic development. That's how the Chinese did it. That's how they are doing
Right.
it continually. Like,
But
their states compete with each other. So if you are in Southeast Asia,
mhm.
it's not that China as a country or its macro level firms cut a deal with a firm in Cambodia. It can be from Sichuan province, they come and have a negotiation.
Right. And the other thing is, can you talk a little bit about, say, Huawei or some of the organizations, because the corporations are not structured like we think of them in the West.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are, of course, very large and important private companies. Many of them were first set up in Taiwan or elsewhere. That's how they have that sort of family structure and so on. But you operate in China. It's not a secret, and there's nothing untoward about it. But the company, the private company, is integrated into the state. It's not necessarily a private corporation. There's a Communist Party person sitting on the board. The Communist Party is at every level of the company. There's always a representative
Right.
from the shop floor who's an elected representative of the party who has a voting presence. And so that's to ensure that the general orientation of the country is in the firm. It's not just out there to eat profit. So if there's mismanagement or there's evidence of theft or there's mistreatment of workers, there's somebody there from effectively the party, which has a relationship to the state, which is also interesting. It's not exactly the state, but
Right.
they know who to call and to get action immediately. So private companies are not so private after all. I mean, I tend to agree in that sense, with some of the Republicans in the United States who say, well, there's no private sector, they blah blah blah. Well, that's actually true. They have a point that this is guided development. This is not free for all. You let the buffaloes run and fall off the cliff. Yeah, this is not that form of the American West development, which is literally you let the buffaloes go off the cliff. This is planned. They are guiding firms. We don't want you to do that. And so when we talk about a private sector, it's actually a misnomer to think of China's private sector as so very different from the state sector, and different from the different levels of the state sector. In other words, the macro level, the high level, the provincial level, the local municipal level, because there are firms that operate at all these levels.
Right.
And all these levels are competing with each other. I mean, we published a very interesting text by Professor Mangja of Fudan University, the economics department, about how did China develop the world's best high-speed rail. Well, the way they did it was that they made public sector or state sector firms compete with each other. So they used competition,
Sure.
but they managed it. It wasn't competition where a firm was coming in and saying, we'll do this for this price, underbidding everybody else, and they end up producing shoddy things because they underbid people. It's not about winning the contract. It's about building the best train. And that's really interesting.
In South Korea, as capitalist as it is, the government will set up. You can have a private hospital, although they have government hospitals and so forth, but you can't be profit, and you can't. What they'll do is they'll set up a government hospital and run it by the book. Then they'll know what the costs are, and then they can regulate like that across the system. That's another way. There are many ways to do this, but there is this kind of state corporate nexus, and it works in some cases. And in the United States, well, we're kind of joking about it, but it's not very funny that it's not working. Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to go on this, but I think that the conclusion simply that Trump came to finally is that, yes, China's model, the Japanese model, the American model in the 1950s and so forth are highly productive and actually get more to more people. Is that a correct statement? Yes.
Look, frankly, we are if we all agree that things like having a decent life for everybody is a moral obligation of humans. If we actually agree on that, and we decide that, look, now the debate is how to do it, and let's not smuggle in the immorality of permanent inequality into the debate about how to do things.
Mm-hmm.
If we're genuinely interested, we can have a pretty scientific discussion and debate. We can put the South Korean thing on the table of where you set prices through a certain thing. We can, take this. We can learn from each other. We can treat, development as a set of experiments which are trying to achieve the same aim. But my fear is that we don't share the same aim, that people have smuggled in some pretty anti-human ideas into the discussion and are pretending it's about something else. So for instance, for years, they fought wars that were very ugly and pretended they were for human rights, for years, or pretended it was to expand democracy.